Ahum Benzagura Pema Siddhi Hung On Ahum Benzagura Pema Siddhi Hung On Ahum Benzagura Pema Siddhi Hung. Namaskar, welcome everyone to my Saturday Dharma talk. I'm Tseten and I am happy to be here for the next 40 minutes or so to talk about the fourth sutta in my series of 34 suttas on the Digha Nikaya of the Sutta Pitaka of the Pali Canon. So a few points, initial points I just want to go through quickly. If you're interested in following these talks, you can go to my blog, www.palisuttas.com. I do post all my blog posts there, the Buddhist ones in any case. If you're interested in my books, you can link to them from the blog, or you can go directly to chronicapress.com. And that will be the only commercial solicitation I will make today. I also have a YouTube channel called Naked Dharma, also called Pali Suttas. The link is there. If you have any questions, it is customary during Dharma talks to hold your questions till the end. However, I prefer it if you ask your questions during the course of the talk, while the matter you're asking about is uppermost in everyone's mind. There is a note card of the talk available. It will be available at the end of the talk. I'll also be posting it on the blog. If you'd like a copy of the note card, please IM me at the end of the talk, and I will provide you with a copy of the note card. You can also find most of my previous talks on note card at the Mount Everest Sim. If you go to look for the Buddhist College, then go to the library. Then in the library, find the room with the desk with the scrolls on it. And if you click a scroll, you'll get the different talks and different scrolls. Also, quick mention, I am working on my book Dharma Notes. Some of you may be familiar with it. I do an annual edition of this book. Around January probably, I'll be doing a fourth edition of this book, and it'll be available at chronicapress.com. I'm also now coming to the end of my translation of the Tao Te Ching. I'm on 60. I just did 65, I believe. There's 81 chapters in total. I'm hoping to bring that out in spring of next year. So, without further ado, today's talk is on the fourth sutta of the Digha Nikaya of the Sutta Pitaka of the Pali Canon, called the Sonadanda Sutta. And this sutta was spoken at Gagara's lotus pond in Champa, in the land of the Angas, a kingdom that, like Kosala, was destined to be annexed by Magadha. The Angas were a mixed-race people in the southeast part of the land occupied by the Mahajanapadas, the 16 great states. Literally, the word means Maha, great, plus Jana, populated, plus Pada, lands. Historically, the Angas were looked down upon as a barbarous race who had annexed part of Magadha in the past. Bimbisara, the Magadhan king, who was a great friend and patron of the Buddha, had killed Brahmadatta, the last independent king of Anga, and seized Champa. And I'm presuming that was before he became a Buddhist, but I'm not sure of that. Bimbisara made it his headquarters and ruled over it as his father's viceroy. The boundary between Magadha and Anga to the east can be seen in the Chanpan or Champa River today. Today it's called the Chanpan River. Couldn't get a proper picture of it, though. I was looking for one. The capital, Champa, was located at the juncture of the Ganges and the Chanpan River. Champa was a great center of trade, noted for its wealth and commerce. A port city, merchants sailed from there to an interesting place called Suvarna Bhumi. The location of Suvarna Bhumi is a matter of debate. It's not the airport in Thailand that was given that name. That's the only picture I was able to get of it. There's an airport in Thailand called Suvarna Bhumi. Some scholars identify it with southern India, perhaps Sri Lanka, whereas others with Southeast Asia, somewhere in the vicinity of Java. The kingdom of Champa in present-day Vietnam was traditionally thought to be descended from Champa but anthropologists now believe that they came from Borneo. The Brahmin Sonadanda essentially owned the town, having been given it, a prosperous and populous place, by Bimbisara. One afternoon he went to the roof of his residence for a nap, only to see the streets filled with throngs of people, all heading to see the Buddha. The Brahmin tells his steward to ask the crowd to wait for Sonadanda. One wonders how exactly this was done, since it took Sonadanda some time to prepare to leave, probably several days. We know this because the rumor of his intention to visit the Buddha reached the ears of a group of Brahmin visitors who had gathered in Champa to conduct some business, and they visited Sonadanda to confirm that he intended to visit the Buddha. Clearly, at least a few days had passed. Perhaps the throng was not so numerous, or perhaps the steward declared an edict that no one should visit the Buddha before Sonadanda, or perhaps Sonadanda simply joined the crowd. It seems likely, however, to my mind, that he simply issued an edict, despite the courteous tone of the Sutta. Sutta makes him sound very urbane and courteous, and that he just sort of asked the crowd to hold back while they waited for him. In any case, the traditionalist Brahmins thought Sonadanda was lowering himself by going to visit the Buddha. That is, incidentally, King Bimbisara there, that picture. I couldn't find a picture of Sonadanda. So the Brahmins thought he was lowering himself by going to visit the Buddha, and they suggested that the Buddha should visit him instead, warning him that his reputation might be damaged by such a venture. More Brahmin pride, something we talked about in a previous Sutta. Interestingly, in the list of positive qualities of Sonadanda that the Brahmins recite at great length as a justification for their statement that the Buddha should visit him and not the reverse, physical beauty is again mentioned as one of the necessary attributes of a great man, indicative of his good karma. You will recall our discussion, I think it was in the last talk, on the 32 qualities of a great man. The text also states that Gautama has, quote, newly gone forth as a wanderer, quote unquote, suggesting that this sutta is early. In addition, the Brahmin Bukarsati, who we encountered in the previous sutta as an older Brahmin who converts to become a lay follower of the Buddha, is a friend of Sonadanda. Sonadanda retorts that since Bimbisara and Bukarsati honor the Buddha, as well as King Pasenadi of Kosala, and the rule of hospitality also obliges him as the host, he will visit the Buddha, citing in rebuttal all of the Buddha's good qualities, and finally declaring that the Buddha is, quote, beyond all praise, unquote. Clearly, Sonadanda is one with Bimbisara and Pukarsati where the Buddha is concerned. Sonadanda's list of the good qualities of the Buddha includes the interesting statement that, quote, the ascetic Gautama, while youthful, a black-haired youth, in the prime of his young days, in the first stage of life, went forth from the household life into homelessness, unquote. This reference to the first stage of life, quote unquote, alludes to the Vedic theory of 4 life stages, the first of which is the student stage. According to one explanation, the student stage of life is a 12-year initiatory cycle that begins at adolescence, which can begin and turn any time between 8 and 12, and therefore ends between 20 and 24 years of age. According to another explanation, the age of 96 is divided into 4 equal periods of 24 years. Thus, the first stage of life ends at age 24. The former theory appears to be the basis on which Nichiren, founder of Nichiren Buddhism, of course, states that in Japan, states that the Buddha left home at the age of 19, whereas the prevalent view is that the Buddha left home at the age of 29. The Buddha himself requires that a monastic be at least 20 to be considered for ordination, thus himself appearing to favor 19 as the end of the first stage of life. According to this northern Buddhist view, the Buddha attained enlightenment after 11 years, at the age of 30, and taught for 50 years instead of 45 years, based on attaining enlightenment at 35. An 11-year interval does seem to fit the events between the renunciation and the enlightenment better as well. According to the Suttas, the Buddha studied meditation under Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramapuda, mastering each system one after the other, meditated alone in the forest, mastering fear, and practiced asceticism, extreme asceticism, for 6 years, starving himself to the threshold of dying. He then gave up asceticism, nurtured himself back to health, and practiced the meditation that he spontaneously discovered as a child under the Bodhi tree, which in turn led to the first jhana. And at some point in this process, he attained awakening. The Suttas make it sound like all this happened virtually at once. But of course, it seems impossible to cram all of these experiences into 6 years, whereas 11 years seems to be exactly right. If you sit down with a pad and work it out, and you'll find it will be very hard to make a reasonable timeline for 6 years for all those experiences. However, the householder stage begins with marriage. Since the Buddha had already married at 16, he was technically also a householder and was certainly in the second stage of life at the age of 29. The Buddha Charita, a non-canonical first century of the Common Era biography of the Buddha that draws on traditional oral sources, implies, although it's a Sanskrit work, it clearly draws on the same kinds of sources as the Pali Canon. This work, the Buddha Charita, implies that Rahula, that's the Buddha's son, of course, Rahula, was at least a few years old when the Buddha left home, not a newborn as the conventional story states, which seems more consistent with a younger than an earlier age based simply on the facts of nature. The Buddha Charita also implies that Gautama renounced during, quote, the first stage of life, and if you want to look that up, it's at chapter 5, verse 40. This passage says that Gautama left, quote, his grieving parents with tear-stained faces, unquote, which is supported by the Buddha Charita, and which I have argued elsewhere, makes more sense than the stock story. The stock story, of course, is that the Buddha left home covertly in the night when his wife and newborn child, Rahula, were asleep, without anyone's knowledge. That's the conventional story of the Suttas. Another interesting detail that might be easily overlooked is the reference to the Buddha being a teacher of gods or devas and men. We have already encountered this detail in the stock description of a Tathagata in the first Sutta. Sonadanda says that, quote, many thousands of devas have taken refuge with him, unquote. That picture is the Buddha in the Tushita realm teaching his mother and assembled devas. The first thing that strikes one about this statement is the reference to thousands. Buddhist cosmology involves enormous numbers, such as 1 followed by 140 zeros. Yet the Sutta refers to many, implying that this number is large. The Deva worlds and their inhabitants are both vast and long-lived, respectively, and the Pali Canon has a clear tendency to exaggerate, yet mere thousands have taken refuge in the Buddha. This seems to be a small number, which suggests, 1, the Dharma is not popular in the Deva worlds. 2, the original conception of the Deva worlds was more limited than the later texts suggest. Or 3, this is a very early Sutta, and the Dharma has not penetrated very far as yet. Yet I prefer the third because it builds on what we already know about this Sutta. As I mentioned earlier, the reference to the Buddha's being young suggests that, and having just gone forth, suggests this is a fairly early Sutta. One could put forward reasonable arguments, of course, for all three views. None of them are unreasonable. As I have discussed before, gods is a very poor translation of devas. Shining or luminous beings would be the literally correct translation. Even stars would be a literally correct translation. These are real, advanced spiritual beings with greater knowledge, beauty, longevity, and power than human beings have, and who occupy higher dimensions of reality than humanity. But the lower orders of devas take an interest in humanity and interact with them, especially with superior men like the Buddha. We will have occasion to refer to the devas throughout the series of talks, including a race of devas who invisibly coexist with men. Sonadanda also says that, quote, whenever he stays in any town or village, that place is not troubled by non-human beings, unquote. This interesting attribute implies that the Buddha has a spiritual power about him, a charisma or a numen, perhaps similar in quality to the power of truth, that repels negative spiritual beings and forces, referring presumably to asuras, ghosts, and demons, as well as the social fact of the experience of such trouble, similarly to the possessing demons that Yeshe encountered and that Lao Tzu describes. This kind of psychosomatic or psychoid trouble appears to be a common feature of ancient humanity, and even today we frequently see people possessed by a wide variety of quote-unquote bad spirits. We simply have a different way of explaining them or non-explaining them, as the case may be. Possessing such a quality, of course, implies a belief in the existence of such a quality. We are beginning to see in these and other similar references the source axioms of Tantra, and those of you who have attended my previous talks know that I'm quite interested in how one can find the seeds, as it were, of later doctrines in the Pali Canon, not just of the Mahayana, but also of the Vajrayana or Tantra. The core concepts are there, if you choose to look for them. The Buddha is also, quote, consulted by the chiefs of the various leaders of sects, unquote, emphasizing his universality and the and the non-exclusive, non-sectarian character of his dharma, which in turn, of course, implies that that quality or character is valued. Apparently convinced, the Brahmins agree to go with Sonadanda to the lotus pool. As Sonadanda approaches and sits beside the Buddha, he begins to get cold feet, thinking, what if I screw up in talking with the Buddha? My reputation and therefore my income may be negatively affected. The conspiracy theorist in me would like to see the repetitive reference to reputation, originally put in Sonadanda's mind by a group of Brahmin businessmen who are visiting the city, as a planned attempt to discredit the Buddha based on the threat that they might not do further business there. It is certainly true that the Buddha was not popular everywhere or with everyone, and there was at least one plot against his life. The Buddha, sensing his anxiety, asks Sonadanda a question. What is a Brahmin? Sonadanda breathes a sigh of relief. An easy question. Sonadanda answers by giving the 5 qualities of a Brahmin, according to the Vedic religion, consisting of 1. Racial caste purity documented to 7 generations, 2. Knowledge of the mantras, 3. Appearance, 4. Virtue, and 5. Wisdom. Then the Buddha asked Sonadanda, could any of these qualities be left out and one still be considered to be a Brahmin? Sonadanda admitted that appearance was relatively unimportant and might be ignored. Then the Buddha pressed Sonadanda, could anything else be left out? Sonadanda conceded that mantras could be left out, for after appearance, they are relatively unimportant, a surprising statement for a Brahmin to make. The Buddha pressed further, and Sonadanda stated that wisdom and virtue are the 2 mutually irreducible qualities of a Brahmin. Thus, Sonadanda says, wisdom is purified by morality. This is quoting, quote, wisdom is purified by morality, and morality by wisdom, unquote. This combination he identifies with the highest good. a thought to which the Buddha concurs. In this text, wisdom consists of the jhanas, the insights, in this text, wisdom consists of the jhanas, the insights, which consist of body consciousness, mental body, psychic powers, past lives, and the law of karma, which together make up the divine I, and the cessation of the corruptions, the asavas, or asavas, consisting of sensuality, clinging to rebirth, wrong view, and ignorance, or avidya. Virtue consists of not taking life, not taking what is not given, or stealing, not committing adultery, which is in this text how the precept against wrongful sex is interpreted, not telling lies, and not drinking strong drink, the familiar 5 precepts of Pansil. Ultimate concepts in the Buddhist system are often expressed in terms of co-determining dyads. Here we see wisdom and morality as the two mutually purifying aspects of the highest good. In the chain of cause and effect, the paticcasamuppada, another relevant term is nidana, another relevant term is nidana, the nama-rupa conjoins the opposites of mind and matter, within which the mutually irreducible co-determination of samskara and vijnana is concealed. In the system of samsara, samsara itself is divided between nirvana and samsara, the formless and form worlds, and the world of neither perception nor non-perception. Samsara itself exists in relation to the supermundane, which together constitute reality. Similarly, karma itself conceals a dyad of cause and effect within it, simultaneously dual, singular, and empty, depending on the point of view. The knowledge of a Buddha is super-knowledge, that is, knowledge that is beyond merely rational knowing, which is constrained by objectification and duality. Super-knowledge is non-separate and non-dual, or trans-dual mind. It is logical and intuitive, analytic and synthetic, experiential and objective, metaphysical and natural. Thus, the highest good is resolved into a supreme dyad, as in the 12-fold chain of cause and effect, matter and consciousness. If you think about the doctrine of paticcasamuppada, the doctrine of the infinite commingling or co-determination of everything with everything else, you can see that the logical structure, this logical relationship that I'm discussing between the unity and the dyad, is actually logically necessary, because there are no absolute unities. They all when you recognize a unity and analyze it, you always find it breaks down into greater and greater complexity, and that goes on infinitely until one just realizes the truth of emptiness. This is a principle of Buddhist logic which one finds implicit in the Pali Canon in these descriptions that I have summarized, and it's quite similar to the modern philosophy of holism, or holarchy. They are also the name that the Buddha gave at the end of his life to his philosophy, which is also a dyad, the Dharma Vinaya, not Buddhism, which it does not correspond to a word that the Buddha used. Note the sequence. Wisdom takes precedence over virtue, because it is from wisdom that virtue follows, as the te follows from the Tao. As we shall see throughout the Pali Canon, wisdom is often the essential salvific principle. In fact, it is usually the essential salvific principle, despite the presence of an alternate interpretation of the Dharma, and at some point we'll be discussing this, that emphasizes renunciation and appears to have competed with the wisdom interpretation to some extent. The other Brahmins vociferously declared that appearance, mantras, and birth should not be disregarded, realizing, of course, the direction that the Buddha was going, thus finally revealing their true faces. Sonadanda defends the Buddha's view, stating that appearance, mantras, and birth count as nothing if wisdom and virtue are not. Yet oddly, he also states that he does not decry appearance, mantras, or birth, and that's a quotation. He does not, quote, decry appearance mantras or birth, unquote. Sonadanda takes refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, but his vacillating character returns, and he frets over what others will think of him in the context of his social position. He worries again about reputation and income. The Buddha gives him a Dharma talk, and he goes away converted, authentically converted, but without any of the realizations that are described in other suttas. And I actually take it back. That, according to the Chinese Buddhist Encyclopedia, which used this slide to illustrate their entry on the Sonadanda Sutta, the implication is that the gentleman on the left is in fact Sonadanda. Not sure about the women, though. So let's summarize then this sutta. When we encounter Sonadanda, he strikes us as a progressive, urbane Brahmin who is strongly, favorably predisposed towards the Buddha, although he is not a Buddhist. Clearly, the Buddha was popular with high-ranking Brahmins, but Brahmins that are more traditional also opposed him, and he was not welcome everywhere or admired by everyone. Despite his initial hesitation, Sonadanda appears, or seems, to be completely attuned with the Buddha's worldview, accepting his arguments concerning appearance, mantras, and birth without hesitation, and defending him quite explicitly and strongly to the Brahmins. However, after converting to the Buddha Dharma and taking refuge in the Buddha Dharma and the Sangha, the initial doubt sowed by the Brahmins in Sonadanda's mind concerning his reputation and his income, clearly important to Sonadanda, caused Sonadanda to vacillate. Nevertheless, the Buddha accepts him as a lay disciple and gives him a talk on Dharma. However, there is no attainment of any deep, transformative insight by Sonadanda, and he leaves the Buddha very much as he came. The translator refers to Sonadanda in a footnote as a Puthajjana, the many folk or average person that we discussed in connection with the first sutta of this series of talks. The Buddha's attitude towards the Brahmins is interesting. He appears to distinguish between an outer religion associated with rites, rituals, and beliefs, and an inner religion which flourished long ago but is now forgotten, which is identical with the essential principles of the outer but opposed to its superficiality. This is consistent, of course, with the fact that the Buddha lived at the very end of the late Vedic period when Brahmanism was considered decadent, and the Vedic religion was losing its appeal to the people because it no longer met their needs or corresponded to their circumstances. I talked about this in my talk on the status of women in ancient India and the Pali tradition. Sonadanda says of him, quote, "He teaches action and the results of action, honoring the blameless Brahmin way of life," unquote. Thus he declares that the law of karma is the essence of the Buddha's religion, which is in turn the essence of the Brahmin's religion. Thus he's defending the Buddhism as consistent with Vedic religion to the Brahmins, which is contrary, of course, to the mainstream view that Buddhism is in fact heterodox. Thus he declares that the law of karma is the essence of the Buddha's religion. The Buddha called this inner religion the wisdom and the discipline, the Dharma Vinaya, not, note, the Vinaya Dharma. Wisdom comes first. As Sonadanda says, quote, "A Brahmin is virtuous because he is wise," unquote. And similarly in Western philosophy, ethics as a philosophical discipline follows from metaphysics, and not the reverse. You can't know what is good until you know what is. As we shall see in our journey through the Digha Nikaya, wisdom is repeatedly emphasized throughout the Pali Canon as the essential salvific principle. Another school of thought can also be discerned in the texts based on the principle of desire or clinging, in the Paticcasamuppada, which is not the root principle, remember. Ignorance is the root principle of the Paticcasamuppada, in which renunciation, dispassion, and monastic obedience trump wisdom. But this view seems to be a reaction to the first, and therefore original view. A reaction obviously can't be the original, nor is desire the root of Paticcasamuppada. The complement of desire is ignorance. The complement of desire rather is non-attachment. The complement of ignorance is wisdom. So that wisdom is actually what addresses the primary root of the chain of interdependence. This dyad of wisdom and virtue continued to divide the Buddha Sangha for many centuries until it finally split into the Hinayana and the Mahayana that we see today, though not without the promise of Ekayana. Okay, that completes my talk for today. That's all I had to say about this Sutta, so it's a little bit shorter than some of the other talks. At this point, I'll consider any questions or discussion they would like to have concerning anything we've discussed, and then we'll conclude with the dedication of merit. So, does anyone have any questions? Phoenix says, what about the dyad of wisdom and very skillful means? In this case, skillful means is virtue. Okay, upaya, skillful means, we haven't really, that hasn't been mentioned yet in the suttas, but yes, I would say that skillful means is essentially the same thing as virtue. And it's also a realization about the nature of virtue, that there are no moral absolutes, that there are only methods and techniques that are relative to the contingencies in which they arise. But we haven't got to that doctrine yet. So it hasn't. You're saying, what about it? Well, what about it is that we haven't got to it yet. We have talked about it a little bit in the context of the first sutta, of course. We discussed the relativism, basically, in the context of ethics and moral observances. So that is skillful means. That is the essential idea of skillful means. So not by that name, but that concept has been introduced in the context of the first sutta. But yes, I agree with you. Skillful means is essentially virtue, or a method, if you want to call it that. Oh, absolutely. Phoenix says, so virtue in Buddhism is considered a relative truth? Absolutely. I'm not sure if you attended my first sutta, or my talk on the first sutta, but that's clearly the message of the first sutta, and I have it on note card if you want a copy of it. But yes, absolutely. There are virtue, ethics, morality, practices, rites, rituals, and beliefs. Beliefs too. The Buddha warns against dogmatism, for example, and as we've learned in this sutta, he's praised for his non-sectarianism. So Buddhism is not a spiritual philosophy that emphasizes absolute ethical norms or even absolute doctrinal norms. It is an experimental, a pragmatic, a flexible and adaptable system of thinking. Properly speaking, of course. Buddhism has, of course, been made into a religion, and therefore there are certainly Buddhist religions which hold a very, very dogmatic views both on belief and practice. But my argument is that this is not consistent with what the Pali Canon actually says about what the Buddha says about ethics and dogmas. And this will come up again in future suttas, where he cautions people against attachment to views, for example. And Argus Portal says, so almost all is allowed so long it is good to achieve enlightenment. Essentially, that's correct. It's whatever, it's contingent on the individual, it's contingent on their place in the path and what they need at that particular moment in order to promote their progress. And something that may be positive in one context may be negative in another context. And you find this later on in the Tibetan tradition, where advanced practitioners, including Padmasambhava himself, are represented as engaging in antisocial acts, or acts which are puzzling or disturbing to people in some way, because they are acting from a transcendent perspective that transcends conventional notions of good and evil. So you find that becomes explicit in later Buddhist texts. And this is not something just said once and forgotten. These are ideas that we're going to encounter repetitively as we go through the suttas, one by one, sutta by sutta, verse by verse, word by word. We're going to go through the entire Digha Nikaya, and we will see. I will point these out as we go along, as these ideas keep resurfacing. But we know, of course, that the Buddha was absolutely opposed to rites, rituals, and beliefs in a dogmatic sense. He declared the inefficacy of ritual, for example, which is nothing more than a rigid adherence to a particular practice. And he says the same thing about beliefs and dogmas. He always seeks common ground. When he's having a philosophical discussion with someone who holds a different views than he does, he seeks out common ground with that person. Once he finds the common ground, then he uses that as the basis for discussion, and then working through the implications of what they share, he leads them to the realization of Dharma. This emphasis on rules in Buddhism actually becomes quite an affliction in some forms of Buddhism, where you have people engaging in elaborate discussions of whether it is permitted to have a cup of coffee in the afternoon, whether alcohol is absolutely prohibited or only relatively prohibited, and so on. Argus Portal says, so at least it fits to Buddhism if Buddhists react with violence to attacks, as example, the fight against fanatic Muslims. That's an interesting problem, the question of self-defense in Buddhism in the context of the First Noble Truth, not taking life. I don't have a definitive answer to that point. But yes, the ethical guidelines are just that. They are guidelines. They are not absolutes. And it's a matter of interpretation and application and context. And now I have read one interpretation of the whole not taking life thing that says that a Buddhist is permitted to defend himself, but not to the point of taking life, for example. What that is based on, in terms of the primary text, I don't know. Perhaps we will find a discussion of something relevant to that point in the suttas. I do know that the Buddha has justified breaking the law if it's done in order to achieve a dharmic purpose, to save a being, for example, from harm. If one has to break a civil law in order to save a being from harm, that is not considered negative, to be productive of negative karma by the Buddha. So this whole ethical theory of the Buddha is something that we're going to be building up again as we progress through the suttas and collate the different references. We will be able to build up an ethical philosophy that may address some of these points. But right now, I think we can say fairly reasonably that the ethical norms in Buddhism are guidelines and not moral absolutes. Buddhism is not Islam or Judaism. There are Zen teachers who drink alcohol, for example. And incidentally, while we're on the topic of alcohol, the familiar prohibition against drinking alcohol, and often even in translations you will read you will read it given as the training rule against consumption of alcohol and drugs. In fact, I took the trouble to look up the Pali. This is a very interesting text, actually, because first of all, in the collection, it's called Pansil, the 5 precepts. It appears frequently throughout the Pali Canon, but not all formulations of Pansil are identical. And one of the most frequent variations, one of the interesting variation is how the prohibition against wrongful sex is interpreted. But another difference that appears frequently throughout the Pali Canon is the 5th item, not drinking alcohol. Sometimes this item appears in the list. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it's left out. I believe in the first sutta, actually, I mentioned that the prohibition against drinking alcohol was not mentioned. Yes, I think it is a good thing. I agree with you entirely, Argus Portal. One is not enslaved to rules. And in fact, it is not the actions which generate karma in Buddhism. It is the intention. So with respect to alcohol, I noticed that this item was sometimes it would appear and sometimes it would disappear. So I took the trouble of looking it up first of all in the Pratimoksha, in the Vinaya, and discovered that it's a very minor offense in the certainly not one of the top 5. It's number 51, and I think the 3rd category down from the most severe offense. I think only confession is required. But even also interesting is I looked up the text, the actual Pali text, and translated it, and discovered that in fact it does not prohibit drugs at all. What it prohibits is the consumption of 3 categories of alcohol. One of the categories of alcohol was used in Ayurvedic medicine as an anesthetic, and therefore presumably extremely powerful. And one of the other types of alcohol mentioned is possibly a kind of mead. Sometimes you see it given as the prohibition, the training rule against the consumption of spirits, wine, and beer, for example. That's closer to what the Pali text actually says. And often you will read in the context, for example, of psychedelics. There are some Buddhists who are interested in psychedelics, including some Buddhist teachers who have taken psychedelics, Asians and Western. And this is often stated, you'll commonly read in texts that either that this is a violation of the 5th precept against the consumption of alcohol and drugs, or problematic to them because of the existence of that rule. Beyond the fact that what we've just been discussing, that the rules are only guidelines, in fact, this rule, the Pali text of this rule, does not even mention drugs at all. It refers explicitly and exclusively to 3 types of alcohol. And it's in the context, sometimes it's in the context of drunkenness. Now, usually it's in the context of drunkenness or heedlessness. More rarely, it's in the context of frequenting drinking establishments. There's a passage in the Pali Canon where the translator points out that he considers this to be actually an earlier form of the rule, which is not prohibiting the consumption of alcohol at all, but prohibiting the consumption of places in which alcohol is consumed. So these are all variations of these principles that we find throughout the Pali Canon, and we can't just seize on one and to the exclusion of the others. We have to look at where they everything, wherever they appear, collate them, compare them, and come to an understanding of what is underlying them, and not simply simplistically say, well, the Buddha prohibited consumption of drugs, therefore it's illegitimate to consume psychedelics, for example, which is a part of Tibetan Buddhism in particular. And it goes back to the original soma, consumption of soma in the Vedic religion. However, that's going to take us on a tangent. I don't want to go too far down that path. So my point is, skillful means, ethics, even beliefs, are all relative. The ultimate truth of Dharma is beyond rationality. And therefore, no rational formulation of Dharma will ever be perfect and complete. And therefore, to be attached to beliefs, as also to rites and rituals, is a form of error, a form of delusion. And that includes all sectarian forms of Buddhism and all religious forms of Buddhism. Any other questions or items for discussion? You're welcome, Phoenix. We still have some time if anyone would like to raise anything else. I did post a message to the Dharma Transmission to the West group on the Digha Nikaya, which is, the title of which means Long Discourses of the Buddha, because I discovered that, in fact, only the average length of the suttas in the Digha Nikaya is longer than the average length of the suttas in the next book, the Majjhima Nikaya, which has more suttas. But it has also, both books have longer and shorter suttas than each other. So that's a rather interesting point to notice, is that in fact the Digha Nikaya is not the longest suttas of the Pali Canon. It's simply a collection of longer discourses on average, including shorter discourses. So what the organizational principle, this raises the question, of course, what is the organizational principle of the Digha Nikaya as distinct from the Majjhima Nikaya? And perhaps by the time we finish, we'll be able to speculate on that, because I certainly don't have an answer on that point today. Argus Portal says, just want to say this Saturday teaching is one of the highlights for me in SL. One can learn much. Thank you very much. That's why I wanted to do it. There's so much in the Pali Canon. The original texts of Buddhism are so incredibly rich and profound and complex. And to simply remain at the level of generalizations about Hinayana or Theravada or Mahayana or Tibetan or this or that really does a disservice to the texts. We really need to look at the texts themselves and to explore them in detail and to comprehend them from a non-judgmental, open natural mind, to use a Buddhist term, rather than from approaching them with some sort of preconceived notion of what they say or what they should say. And when one approaches Buddhism in that way, it's amazing what one discovers. And that is, of course, the opening to the Akayana and the Dharma transmission to the West. The new Buddhism that is now forming in the West and as a result of that in the world. We're entering a new epoch of Buddhist understanding. Now, for the first time in history, we can collate all Buddhist texts and understand them as a totality. Any other questions or discussion before we move on to the dedication of merit? Okay, it seems not. So let's conclude then. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much. I remind you again, if you would like the note card, please, for this talk, please IM me now, and I will send you a copy of the note card. So, thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. I'll be back here again next Saturday at 3 p.m. Second Lifetime to discuss the 5th Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. I'll be posting the name of that Sutta in the Dharma Transmission to the West group. If you have not joined the Dharma Transmission of to the West group, I would recommend that you do so that you can keep track of my activities and also post relevant messages there from time to time as well. So again, thank you. Namaskar.